Librarian Archives, and today, this session, I will be going over the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, which that's a mouthful, so I'm just going to call it the Alliance from here on out. Their Simplified Data Management Plan template, also a mouthful, but we'll just call it the Alliance Simplified template for now. So what we're going to be covering in this session, which I don't anticipate taking the whole hour, it will depend on questions and comments and so on, is I'm going to do like a little overview about what a data management plan is, why we should be making them when we're doing a research project, the benefits and the barriers, some essential components, and then I'm going to take us into the DMP or Data Management Plan Assistant. It's an online tool, and I'll show you this template and just how to use the tool as well. And this is being recorded, so if you ever need to go back, you can watch the video or just get in touch with me. So the first thing is a data management plan is part of research data management as a whole. And research data management is just the organization of your research data through the entire research lifecycle, which you can see in this image. Um, Research data management is really vital to producing good quality research, and it's really beneficial to just adopt some research data management practices. Many researchers are already kind of doing this naturally and intuitively. A data management plan would occur at the very beginning of the process in the planning stages, and it really is kind of like a foundational component to your research process and project. So what is it? It's a formal but living document detailing your data management strategy and tools. And it allows you to manage your data before, during, and after the data collection phase. And more commonly, it's becoming a standardized document to include in your grant application. And I realize this kind of might sound like a bit like at odds with each other. It's a living document, but it's also a standardized document. When we say it's a standardized document, it means that there's quite a few like templates that will work for every researcher, give or take a few benefits and disadvantages, which we'll get into. It's a living document, so what you put into it at the beginning can change and adapt as your research project changes and adapts. The main thing is with a data management plan, I always say what you put into it is what you get out of it. So if you keep it pretty sparse and very skeletal, that's what it's going to do for you. It's just going to be like a sketched outline of your project. If you make it really detailed, it's going to be very detailed and potentially incredibly beneficial, or depending on how detailed, it could be a little bit of too much information. So it's a bit of a fine balance, but it is very beneficial. Some of the benefits of a data management plan are just increased awareness and attention paid to data collection. So that could be things just like really thinking through at the start of a research project, like how are you going to name your files and organize your files? What metadata are you going to use? For all our STEM researchers out there, if you're setting up a lab, a DMP can help you plan for your standardized operating procedures and SOPs, and like how you're going to train students. If you're working on a team, it can help you determine like who's going to do what role? How are you going to make sure everyone's consistent in their process for collecting data? So it really like kind of forces you to pay attention to what you're doing. And that can lead to improved organization, which also is beneficial because then at the end of your project, there's a lot greater potential for data retention and sharing. Sharing is always a bit of it can be a hot topic depending on research circles and who I'm talking to, because data sharing is, for some disciplines, it's very common, for others, it's very new. I always say you don't have to share your data unless you want to. I encourage data sharing, even with lots of like limits and checks and balances, because ultimately it is beneficial for you as a researcher and for your research community. But you'll always want to have some data retention, and making a data management plan does help you figure out Well, how long do I have to save my data? Where am I going to save my data? What things do I need to consider? Am I using a very specialized type of software that might need to be updated on an annual basis? Am I like late career? Do I have to consider who's going to get my data when I retire? Am I early career? Do I have to consider how I can use my data to further my career on? So a data management plan can really help you think about those things for a research project. I also really promote the data management plan as a discussion tool, and this is going to depend on the type of research you're doing. But in particular, if you're working with Indigenous peoples, communities, if you're collecting Indigenous data, a data management plan can be used as a discussion tool when you're connecting with those communities and you're coming to your agreements on what data is going to be collected and what data will be retained and so on. Depending on the community you're in, they might have processes in place, which in that case you would follow and respect them. But if it's two groups that are very new to it, it can act as a way to start the discussion. Same thing if you're working with like other marginalized communities or doing community action-based research, that can help you with the discussion when you're working with the group. I also say data management plans are useful if you're working with teams and collaborating, because it does get you all talking about it. And again, as previously mentioned, it can be really useful for like determining how you're going to set up a lab, how you're going to talk to students or so on about the research and training. That doesn't mean a data management plan is a perfect thing. There are barriers. One of the biggest ones, and I feel this is kind of like we just need to shift our mentality a bit, is a lot of people talk about the time. Well, it's just another thing I have to do. I have to do it and complete it, and that takes up time. Um, yes, that's true, but it's also like if you put the time into it now, if you kind of front load it, it means you're not going to be solving those problems on the fly later on in your research project. So the time thing, it's very much a mental image that we need to shift. Another barrier to the data management plan as they currently exist is some people do report that the templates are too generalized or there's not enough discipline-specific templates. That is an issue that we're constantly working on. Like I know my community of data librarians in Canada, we're always working and developing templates to specific types of research and to specific disciplines to kind of get over that issue of, well, the template's too generalized. One other barrier that was reported in the study by Reed and Rutley is not having all the answers. So sometimes when you're making a data management plan, you don't quite know how to answer one question. And that's okay. And that was a very common barrier with what was called like the old template or the portage DMP template. The simplified one is trying to kind of alleviate that by not making you have to get so specific or in the weeds at the data management plan stage. And again, another barrier to the DMP, and this is just like we need to shift our thinking about it, is the idea that you finish it and forget it. It's something you have to tick off to get your funding. And that's really not the mentality we should have. Like you might have to do a DMP for your funding, but it should be a useful tool in your research project. All right. The last thing before we actually get into the data management plan templates, this is something I get a lot. I don't need to make a data management plan, but I need to talk about RDM on my funding application. One thing I recommend to people is you can use the simplified template questions, which you'll see. And on these slides, there's links to the template in a PDF format. Or focus on these 4 areas: ethics and legal compliance, which would be asking yourself, are you working with an Indigenous community or another community group? It would be like, are you working with a private or third-party group that could impact your ability to share and reuse data? Do you need to include data deposit and sharing in your consent form if you're working with human participants? Are your data sensitive? Like, do you need to consider specialized storage? And maybe that will come at a cost. Even things like, do I need to talk to the Research Ethics Board? Do I need to talk to the Office of Research Services or the Office of Research innovations and partnerships. Are there other groups I need to get in touch with to make sure that all my legal compliance issues and ethical compliance issues are covered? So that would be one of the biggest things to consider if you need to talk about research data management on a funding application. Another huge one is storage and backup. So do you have to meet a specific security standard for storing your data? Again, that goes back to are my data sensitive? Like, do I need to consider specialized storage? In some cases, depending on your research project, you might be fine just using our institutional SharePoint or OneDrive. In other cases, you might have to purchase like specialized space, so on. What storage and backup systems are available to you already? So that's looking at like what is available through the university, what have you maybe purchased on your own that you can use, what cloud-based solutions are out there, so on. Do you have large data, and what data needs to be prioritized in storage and backup? So if you're working with big, big data files, maybe you need to consider like, I can't back up every single piece of data I'm collecting, but I have to back up this one tool because that's vital to my research process. Those are things to consider when you're asked to talk about research data management. Sharing and reuse is another thing to include on the funding application form about research data management. So do you need to share your data? Some disciplines require that you deposit certain types of data into certain repositories. So do you have like community standards, disciplinary standards? Are there international standards that you might have to consider? So for example, if you're working with someone in like the EU or the UK or Australia, they have stricter RDM requirements, and maybe you need to consider that. If you intend to publish your research project, does the publication you're thinking about require data sharing and deposit? This is becoming much more common with publications where they have recommended repositories and they want you to deposit your data in them. Something to consider, especially if you might have to consider open access or open data requirements. So our biggest funder in Canada, the tri-agencies, do not require open data. Their policy is very strictly as open as possible, as closed as necessary. But data deposit will be coming down the pipe in the future, way in the future at the rate we're going currently. But those are things to consider. And our last one is documentation and metadata. And that is just really talking about like, what type of data are you collecting? What formats are the data coming in? How are you going to make that data findable by others and understandable by others? So those are things like, do you need to make a README file? Do you need to include a data dictionary? Are you using a specific metadata standard? So those are kind of the 4 areas you should focus on if you have to talk about RDM in a funding application, but you don't have to make a DMP. And those are really the key areas that you will have to talk about if you're making a DMP using the simplified template. So just a little bit of history on this. This is relatively new. I would say it's almost a year old. It's really about 6 months old in terms of rollout. It is intended to be attached to tri-agency funding opportunities where DMPs are mandatory, but you do not have to use this template. If you like a different template, you can use that. It's intended to make a data management plan that is really no more than 3 pages, which is why it's ideal for funding opportunities. There's 5 broad questions, and I always like to say in some cases it's the first step, but not the final step. So you might need to go back and add more detail to this after you get your funding and after you get REB approval and after you get everything sort of sorted and you're really ready to start. I'm just going to jump to a PDF version of what this template looks like. So this is something you can link out to it if you download the slides, but it gives you all the questions and guidance in like a little 2-page handout. And that's something you can refer to at any point if you want to do this template. Or the other thing we're going to do is I'm going to take us to the DMP assistant. And I'm going to open a new tab because I'm going to show you how to get to the DMP assistant from the Archer library. So Archer library, we go to research, data services, scroll down a little bit, research data management planning, and DMP assistant. And in this case, because I've already logged in, it automatically opened to my account in the DMP assistant. It's very easy to make an account. You can use the institutional login to make your account, or you can make one with a different email if that's your preference. Once you're in, this is kind of what it looks like. So you'll have the first thing that will come up is your dashboard. And if you want to create a whole new plan, you would just click Create Plan. And then you kind of get into this very like easy sort of just type right into the interface. If you want to do one for testing, you can click this one off. And you can like enter your organization and so on. Oops. And then you would click Create Plan. Oh, you also get the option to use different templates. So here you can see all the various templates that are available through the DMP assistant. So the simplified one is really just one template. And this is where you'll see ones where they're much more specific to certain disciplines or certain types of research. And you can use those to make your DMP. So I'm just going to actually close this and jump back because I already have a DMP ready for this presentation. So this is my test template using the Alliance Simplified template. So the first thing that's going to come up is you're going to be prompted to enter some project details, including the title of the project. I would encourage using something a little bit more specific than what I've put in. You can put in your project abstract. You can add some metadata features. So research domain based on subject, your project dates, an identifier. If you're already funded, you can include that. So who is the funder, the funding status, the grant number, and then at the end of each component of the DMP, always remember to just save. So that's your first little bit. It's just some basic metadata on your project. Then you'll get to contributors, which is where you can add team members and identify their role. And you would just click Add a Contributor, put in name, email, ORCID if applicable, affiliation, and you can assign roles if you want to. And then again, remember at the end just to always save. The next thing we have is the plan overview. And this is the same thing that I showed you in that PDF document. So it's just going over the questions and the guidance all together, if that's your preference. So a little refresher on what to do. And now let's get into it. So now we're ready to write our plan. So the first thing that's going to come up is introductory guidance. So just things to consider. And then you'll see this text block here. You don't need to put anything in this block because you don't have to contribute anything to the introductory guidance. This is just, unfortunately, a flaw in the software where the developers cannot take this text block out for some reason in this template. So Don't put anything in that block. Don't stress if you don't have anything in the introductory guidance block, you don't need it there. What you need to go into is the plan questions. So before we really get into these individual questions and some of the guidance that is provided with each of them, as well as like my examples of what you could put in there, I'm just going to take a quick pause for questions. So feel free to unmute yourself or pop something in the chat. Okay, hearing nothing, let's get into it. So the first question on the simplified template is, what considerations will you take into account with respect to ethical, legal, or commercial issues? And the way this is set up is it tells you like what this means by ethical, legal, or commercial issues. So what is this question asking you to do? And then on the side here, you'll see some potential types of guidance. So things that the Alliance has highlighted for this question is things like, are you working with Indigenous communities or other marginalized groups where you have to consider data stewardship, appropriate sharing? If you're working with human participants, how are you going to communicate that you are keeping data, sharing data, depositing data, and also like how are you going to safeguard your data if necessary? So that's some of the stuff here. And I've provided an example from like a type of research I do quite commonly, which is evidence synthesis research, in particular scoping reviews. But this would be like my sample answer for this question. So most of the data that I generate for my type of research is from searching existing published publications and then like extracting themes from said publications. So I don't have a lot of ethical issues to address. The only thing I do really need to keep in mind that could get ethical or legal is the PDFs of the extracted articles are protected under copyright, so they can't be shared with any collected data beyond like the citation information. So that would be an example of a response to this question with a very specific type of research. Okay, question 2. What data will you collect or otherwise bring into your project under this plan? So this is where you describe the data that will be collected, generated, and or acquired. So not just the data that you yourself are collecting and creating, but also if you're using any secondary data. So another component of my job is I give researchers a lot of access to Statistics Canada open data. If you were working on a research project where you were using, say, the Canadian Community Health Survey, you would want to include that you were using that data, what years, and what form that data was coming in. So if you were using a public use microdata file, that's one form of that data. If you were going to the research data center at Innovation Place and using the more granular data, you would put that in because those are two different types of data, even though they come from the same survey. So if you look at the guidance on the side here, they give some examples of what they mean by research data. So it would be data files, questionnaires, transcripts, samples, physical collections, software algorithms, lab notebooks, so on. It's very, very thorough what we can consider data. And we really want to make sure that we're describing our data types, how we're collecting them, and whether or not we think this data will be sensitive. And another thing too is our data going to be in proprietary or non-proprietary formats? So a proprietary format would be, for example, an Excel file. A non-proprietary format would be a CSV file. Those are all things we kind of need to consider. And again, with this question, what you put into it is what you get out of it. So this is a question where, as when you first do it, you might realize later on that No, this was a type of data that we're also collecting, and you might need to add to it. For my example, again, with a scoping review, the data collected or generated would be the search process, the themes extracted from the data, and then the documentation of the search strategy. So the data will come in forms of like PDF articles, because that's what we're kind of extracting from the search. Typically Word documents containing protocols on how a search is being conducted, the line-by-line search strategies, other types of protocols called Prisma checklists, and important project documents. And then we have a specialized type of file format with RIS files of exported searches and CSV documents of extracted themes. So those are all examples of like data that I would collect in the research process and would want to include in my data management plan. Okay, next question. How will you document data for future reuse or validation? So with this, it's like, how are we going to make our data so that it is easily read and interpreted correctly throughout the research process? And I always say that we have to consider this on two levels. One is so that we and our potential research team or anyone else who might be working with us can all understand the data and how it's being saved, and also at a greater level, how people outside the research team, whether that be peer reviewers, supervisors, other researchers in our field, how are we documenting that data so that they can read and understand it? This is something that I always feel it can be like kind of brushed off. Some people might want to do that, but it's actually really vital when we think about like the research process down the road. I was just yesterday reading an article about how like bad research data management can lead to articles being retracted because the data wasn't documented properly enough, or like the data wasn't stored in a repository. So when an error was flagged in the peer review process or even post-publication, the researcher just popped into their OneDrive and made a change. And is that ethical? Like those are all things that we can consider when we think about how we document our data. Um, and there's lots of ways we can do that. It's going to depend on your discipline. If you do have more questions about this, it's way easier for us to have a one-on-one conversation because it's going to very much depend on what research you're doing and what area you're doing your research in. But documentation can include data dictionaries, code books, README files, lab and field notes, code and syntax, and user guides. It can also sometimes include metadata standards. And those are all the things you need to consider when you're answering this question. So in my sample answer, I have like, this is what the search strategy will look like and how things will be identified. This will be like other types of data that we're going to document is how we conduct certain searches. And then we'll have protocols and Excel files containing descriptions of how data was extracted and categorized, which is very common for scoping reviews. Okay, another doozy of a question. It's so short, but it can get so big so quickly. How will data be stored, accessed, and worked with? And so this is a big question because we need to think about the raw data, the working data, so the data that's being cleaned and analyzed, and then the final data when we're talking about this question. So that's why it says, describe all versions of the data and how it will be stored. Describe all activities as much as possible. So what does the collection side look like? What does the processing side look like? Analysis and dissemination. Include the software and platforms you're going to use for storing your data, including like you might get some specialized cloud storage for your active data through the Alliance, or you might just use our SharePoint. But then your final data, you might just be able to store on like an institutional drive type thing. So it's really going to depend on like where the type of data. Another thing to consider is, do you need to have any security measures? Again, if your data is sensitive, there might be only certain people who can access the data at certain points. You might have to use more secure types of storage. So for example, if you're working with health data, you might have to use the software called RedCap. Um, and then how will your data be backed up to prevent data loss? So those are all things to consider. Ideally, we recommend what's called 3-2-1 for data storage. So 3 versions of the data on 2 different systems, one being in a different location than from where the other one is. That's sometimes not always possible. So again, if we think about this and the amount of data we're collecting and how we have to back it up, that can also really impact things like how much do we need to budget for our data storage? So for my example, scoping reviews really don't need a lot of data storage, including backups. And because they aren't like highly sensitive, a lot of the work can be kept within like an institutional password protected program. There is some specialized software involved, which I've talked about in my sample example. So we use Covidence a lot, but and we use Zotero as well. But for the most part, like my data storage needs are quite small for my project. Okay, I believe this is our last question. Yes. So the last question on the simplified template. How will your data be managed, discoverable, and accessible for the long term? So this is where you would talk about, do I need to deposit my data and what data should be deposited? Do I need to consider long-term preservation of my data? So I know this data is valuable enough that 10 years from now, other researchers might want it. That would be preservation. Do I need to consider ethical compliance? So, like, does my discipline require that data be destroyed in 5 years? Do I need to consider ethical compliance for working with human participants? So on. And then just also, where am I going to store this data? So what software and platforms would I use? So this is where you would consider obligations from funders, publishers, your own institution's policies. Does the data need to be destroyed? Is the data highly sensitive? And do you need to do a lot of de-identification? Is the software that you're using needed for continued access? Do you have to consider things with code? Do you have to consider like commercial agreements or so on? And how does that affect the sharing and reuse in the long term? And again, for a scoping review, for the most part, the data can just be kept in our institutional data repository, Borealis Dataverse, because it is like a small data set with very low risk data. So as you can see, at the end of each question, there is an option to save. So that means you can save like one question and then leave it for a little bit and come back to it, or you can do it all at once. I just always recommend that you make sure you save your work. But that is the simplified template. It's 5 questions. It can get pretty big, but it's not meant to. So once you've done that and you've saved everything, if we scroll up to the very top, we can put in some research outputs. This is fairly new. And you could put in some examples of your intended repositories. You can link the metadata standard you're going to use, so on. You can also share this. So let's say you've made a DMP and you're like, I really want a second set of eyes on this. You can share this to me. And as the data services librarian, I can give it a quick once over, see if there's any questions that you might want to expand upon, so on. Or you can just keep it private. or you can invite collaborators. So if you want to add other team members, so on. And then the final thing you would do is download. So you can download it as a PDF. It will include all the sections, and then you print it off and it's right there, or attach it to your funding opportunity. So this is meant to make things as painless as possible. All right. So the last little bit I have to cover is just some of what Archer Library and Archive services are. So I've already discussed, I provide assistance on reviewing and advising on DMPs. I provide assistance on using the DMP Assistant and also the DMP tool. That's more if you're working with American researchers. And I can also help you find templates and exemplars of DMPs. There are a lot of Creative Commons attribution non-commercial templates out there and exemplars where they like tell you how to answer all the questions, and you can kind of look at that and consider if that's a good option for you and put that in your data management plan. That's all designed to help you as a researcher, and a lot of them are made by researchers and with support from librarians. So those are some of the services we offer at Archer. And yeah, we're here. We're at the question part. Are there any questions? Comments? And here's the fun part where it's like I'm slowly counting to 10 in my head because I want to give people the opportunity if they're putting something in the chat. Oh, thank you, Anna. Yeah, if you do think of any questions later on in the road, or say, for example, a year from now, or 6 months from now, or many years from now, you have to make a DMP and you're just like, I need help, just get in touch with us here at the library. We will help you out with this. And yeah, otherwise, thank you so much for coming. I hope you all had a great time.
Kaetlyn,
Yeah.
Gabriella put in there if you could just touch quickly on data storage options we have at the university.
Yeah. So data storage, we do have, I don't know how official it is yet, but we, through our Teams instance, we have like SharePoint, which is a secure form of data storage. We also have options for like if you need some if you need more storage than what is available, you can get in touch with IS, and it's usually for a cost. You can get some additional storage. Another option we have too, this is for cloud-based storage, and the research IT support team can assist you with this, is through the Alliance, we can get what's called Rapid Access Service, and it's a specialized form of cloud storage. That is available, and the RITS team can support with that. There's also some very specialized types of data storage and software depending on your data sensitivity. So we do have a very limited option of REDCap that's really vital to our health researchers. But there are options, and some of them are within the institution, and some of them are things that, because of our memberships with the Alliance and so on, we can like help you get access to it. Hope that covered everything. Sorry. Recommended methods for storing data meant to be shared. So for data that's meant to be shared, it's going to depend on like, can you put it in a repository? I saw, Gabriella, in your comment that it's like government data, which sometimes they don't want things in a repository. Because then you would actually make, if you put it in a repository, that doesn't mean it's just open to everyone. It means it's findable to everyone, but you can restrict access until someone like agrees to your terms of services and you get give them permission and so on. So a repository would work for that. Um, another, like, we don't really have a set recommended place to store your data long term with intention of sharing, which is something that RDM steering committee is trying to work on. But I always just recommend, like, if it's on an external hard drive, check it once a year to make sure everything's still working. That is something our researchers do, is they just keep their data long-term on external hard drives they've purchased. Don't keep your data on a flash drive. A flash drive is a data transfer tool. It is not a data storage tool. But you can also like get in touch with me one-on-one and we can discuss this a little bit further because I would have to double check a couple things too. Okay. All right, last call for questions, and then I'll let everyone get back to their Fridays. All right. Do feel free to reach out to me. The best way to get me is through email, um, because I am terrible at checking my messages on my work phone. So email is the easiest way to do it. Otherwise, thank you all for coming, and I hope you all have a fantastic day and weekend.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you.